I released a sample pack not too long ago called Sonix Volume 01. It was my first ever sample pack, and we had thrown out a survey and asked everyone who had purchased it what they liked most about the pack, and I was kind of surprised to find out that a lot of people mentioned beats, drum beats. I never really thought of myself as a beat maker per se, although drums were my very first instrument. So I figured today I would take a break from dealing with modular things and hardware and kind of jump into the box. I'll show you a little bit of how I make beats, what my process is, and then you take that and make them better. I'll even throw in a few free loops at the end that you can use for whatever you want. So let's jump into things on this episode of Celldweller Production. So in this first beat, I just have a battery instrument loaded up with a bunch of kind of vinyl-y one-shot sounds. They don't sound amazing, but what I generally tend to do is throw compression after battery so that my drums are going through compression and I can kind of hear what they're going to sound like, because it will radically change the sound. So without any compression, this beat sounds pretty underwhelming like this. And there's some MIDI, which took a half an hour to open, but here we go. So what I'll now do is I have a couple of plugins already set on this channel, which are ironically both Waves plugins. I'm using the Kramer Pi and the JJP drums plugin as well. And that changes the loop that you just heard to this. So you instantly get a sense for how much that actually changes the sound of the drums. So I'll generally go through and start programming loops with compression on so that I can actually hear what the end result is, as you can see there. So there's an example of a beat, and what I'll oftentimes do is take that, print that down to audio once I have it sounding the way I want to, and then chop it up even further and maybe layer that with some other drums as well. On a final stage as well, which we're not hearing, I generally have more mastering-based things when I'm just exporting beats. So on my outputs of 1 and 2 here, I have this SSL comp. Although I have a full SSL console here, which sounds great, sometimes I will also actually use emulation, which doesn't sound nearly as good, but this SSL emulator, which is also a Waves-based plugin, coupled with one of my fave mastering plugins of all time, which is Isotope Ozone 5, and you get some nice, you start dialing in some settings here, and that actually rounds out the beat even more and just kind of makes it fuller. And here's your threshold. So the more I bring this down, the further I bring this down, the harder it's going to limit the signal. So you can very easily destroy your signal and you can ruin your sound. So these kinds of controls are pretty small and you're listening for minute changes. Let's jump into another beat, which would be this one. Little kind of drum and bass thing, again, put together with just a bunch of kind of vinyl samples and battery, programmed out a bunch of MIDI. And again, you're hearing it with nothing on it. So you enable what I have going on here, which is another Kramer Pi, and then I'm using another company that I absolutely love, which is FabFilter. I'm using the Pro Q to do some EQing, boosting a little bit on the lows, cutting a little bit of the mids. And then I've got the Pro MB, which is FabFilter's multiband compressor, and I'm basically using that to kind of take out a little bit of the top end here. As you'll see, whatever's hitting in this region is being ducked. So as opposed to an EQ where I'm just straight cutting these frequencies out or boosting these frequencies, in the multiband compressor, it will only actually affect the frequency when there is frequency information in that range. So when there is information here, it'll compress or expand however I want to set that up. And this plugin sounds great, and I use it all the time for a lot of different things. I'm sure you will see more tutorials in the future on how I use that to make my vocals fit with my guitars and things like that. So that fairly boring drum and bass loop with a little bit of compression and EQ and other kinds of things sounds like. So you get a bigger, you get a much bigger sound, and that of course is still without any mastering on it. So once I put my mastering chain on and turn these on, which will take forever because we're screen recording. So today's hurry up and wait day here at Celldweller Studios. So you can hear and see the difference in sound, basically, in this case, by only using software. So I'm programming beats, and don't get me wrong, I don't only always just use software. I have a lot of hardware around here too that I will also run beats through to get different results. Here's another plugin that I wanted to show you, and I wanted to show this to you because this plugin was actually designed to be a vocal processing plugin, and it's a great sounding vocal processing plugin. This thing though, one thing I've always done in my career is I have abused plugins and used them for purposes that they were never really meant to be used for. So Joey Sturgis, who developed this plugin, which is called Gain Reduction, gave me this as a preview to show me, kind of to say, hey, check out this plugin, let me know what you think. And of course the first thing I did was, instead of running a vocal through it, which is what I should have done, I ran a beat through it. And it really does sound incredible. The plugin's $35. You really have no excuse not to go out right now and buy it. But I'll show you a live drum loop that I played. So I played this beat and exported it. So it's just a live loop that I played with no processing. There's no mastering chain on. There's nothing on this channel. It's just simply the beat. That's what I would call extremely, extremely underwhelming. Now, we take an extremely underwhelming beat like that, which I've cleaned up and kind of tightened up. Doesn't sound great. And now I throw Joey's Gain Reduction plugin on here, which has very few settings. It's very difficult to screw this up because there's not much you can do here, which is why this plugin is so great, because you don't have to wrestle with it to make something sound great. Now, I wanted to bring out more transients. I wanted a little more attack, so what I did is I used Native Instruments Transient Master afterwards to bring out some of the attacks of the kicks and the snares. So instantly you can hear how much better that loop sounds. It sounds really big and very roomy, but I still want to bring out even more attacks. So what I ended up doing is taking a snare drum from my Sonix 01 sample pack and layering that on the snare. So you'll hear me drop that in. I'll unmute the track while this is playing. So that's a little bit loud as far as the snare is concerned, but again, when I go over to my mastering chain and start popping in my SSL compressor and ozone, then that starts bringing that snare level down, and it starts to glue that whole drum beat together. Now, I would probably continue to take this further. I would probably end up printing this, and then I might go in and bring that new audio file in, maybe shave some of the low end out of the kick drum and layer a more attacky tight kick drum under that. It's all experimentation. So I'm basically just showing you some general principles. You can take these ideas and go much further with them, as I would as well. So here's another live loop that I played at some point in my career, and I bounced this beat out. And again, it doesn't sound incredibly amazing, by itself. And then it'll just keep looping around. So in a case like this, what I'll oftentimes do is start with a live loop like that. And what I generally like about live drums, being drums was my very first instrument, so I've always had a love for live drums. But when it comes to electronic versus organic, when you play a live instrument like that, it's different every single time you hit it. So every strike of a hi-hat, it's different. There's something slightly different that takes away a little bit of that repetition of a single sample being played over and over again. I do love that sound too, and I use it quite a bit in my tracks, but there's the other side of things where I like things that change a lot as well. So it's the combination of those two things that basically make Celldweller what it is, or what I am. So in this case, I've got something that changes on every single hit. I've got a live drum, and so what I want to do then is now augment that with other kicks and snares. So I took a kick drum from my Sonix 01 pack and layered that with the live loop. So you can hear it on the low end. You're hearing much more of a punch than you did with just the live loop alone. And the same goes for the snare. So I went through, and I don't ever, not that I'm too good for it, I just never did. I guess I just wasn't smart enough to learn how to do it, but I don't really use plugins to replace my drums. I do everything by hand. So I take my kicks and I place them where I want on the grid. I take my snares, I place them where I want on the grid, and if I want to change velocity or volume, I'm doing all of that stuff manually, which is why it takes me 30 years to put out an album. Let me unmute the snares, and now you've got kicks and snares, synthetic kicks and snares layered underneath an organic drum beat. Now again, doesn't sound absolutely amazingly incredible, but the glue that starts bringing all this stuff together is when you start running it through final chains like mastering. So again, I'm going to use my SSL compressor. I'd really love for you to see the peaks and kind of how it's hitting ozone, but the screen cap software is running so slowly on this rig because this machine is so old that it's not going to be completely effective. But believe me when I tell you, this is catching the transients of the snares and the kicks and everything else that's in there and bringing everything together, kind of gluing your sound together. Again, I'm not sitting here telling you this is the most perfect beat I've ever made. I'm just showing you basically some of the principles of how I would make a beat. I would generally bounce this in as audio once I have it dialed in, and continue to process it more. So there's a quick example of how I would maybe take another live loop, layer it with synthetic elements to create something more punchy, but yet organic and constantly evolving, and still sounds live. As one final example of maybe how I would process a beat, let's go into something more synthetic. I took a loop that I've already released on my Sonix 01 pack. I keep mentioning that, but I might as well use it because I won't sue myself for using my own samples. So I took this loop, which is so that's already been processed. You can hear kind of like some grit and tone, and I think I made that through my Moog Voyager right there. I think I programmed out some beats and ran it through the filter of my Moog Voyager, did some more things to it, but that's essentially the beat. And what I'll often do when I want to get a little more grimy or try to just mix things up, I'll start throwing distortion and bit crushing plugins at some beats. So in this case, I'm using the WoW 2 plugin, which is really handy. I use it a lot for a lot of different things. In this case, I'm going to throw it on. It's not really doing much because until I start turning the gain up. And this particular algorithm that I'm using sounds pretty awful on this beat, but I'm using this just to show you kind of where I would start. So I'm going to change the distortion algorithm here. You'll hear it. I'll change it while I'm playing the beat back. So there's a lot of different ways you can go, but I generally use this 1-bit algorithm, which sounds really crunchy and cool. And it's very noisy and unpredictable, so I generally dial something in. So that's kind of noisy and gross. So now what I just did is I bounced that effect back in. So I've got a brand new audio file here with that bit crushing applied to it. And you start to get very noisy very quickly because bit crushing by default starts filling in gaps of silence with noise and everything else. So what I'll do is I'll start looking at things on the grid. Okay, so the screen cap software is making this thing so sluggish that we're going to resort to a different method so I can show you this final loop. So bear with me. So I just bounced this loop from Sonix 01 through the WOW2 plugin, which was in a bit crushed algorithm, and bit crushing by nature fills in silence and everything else with noise. It gets very noisy. So as you can see where the original loop, I have some space here. You can now see that when I bounced in the loop through the bit crusher, it's filling in with lots of noise. So here's where I start getting surgical, and I'll kind of go in and start chopping out sections of audio and making little rhythms out of them and experimenting with cleaning some things up and getting rid of the noise, and you turn a noisy loop into something a little more cool and rhythmic by putting little spaces in between notes, or in this case, rhythms. So right away, those first two hits bleed into each other, so I will peel back that first one, leave a little space, and now you've got two distinct hits as opposed to, you have two hits there, whereas it was that, which kind of bled together. So there, I'm getting a little bit, to me that's a little noisy, it kind of bleeds together too much. I want it to be a little more rhythmic, so let me tighten that. You can hear instantly how you start cleaning up a beat like that, and it's still very noisy, but now it still feels edited and surgical as opposed to just a stream of white noise. So let me clean this up a little bit. Not even doing it on the grid, I'm just going by feel. And so let's do this. Start doubling up some notes. Here, let's do this. So I'm basically taking the same hit and duplicating it 4 times on the grid, which is a lot of how I do my editing, and I have done for years. It's all by hand. And there you go, I just created, something that 10 million plugins can now do for you in 2 seconds. So, but I'm old-fashioned, so I do it the old way, the old school way. And there's no real rhyme or reason, it's just because that's what I'm used to doing. Again, kick here, these are two kick drums, but they're bleeding together, so I'll split them on the grid, and I'll peel back the end of that first one, so what it does is it forces some space between your kick drums, and then gives you a much more audible double hit as opposed to 2 hits that kind of just bleed together. So in this case, let's look at so here's just a chunk of this loop right here before I edited it. And here's that same bit after I just went and chopped and cleaned things up. And you can hear how I do that over the course of an entire loop like this. And then oftentimes I'll go back to the original loop, or I'll take other drum hits or other sounds and start inserting them in place of here. So let me just take a piece of the original loop instead. Doesn't sound great because I think the bit crushed version of that snare sounds better, but you understand the concept. There are no rules. It's mixing and matching. It's processing, bouncing audio back in, re-editing, more mixing, more matching, and then of course your final step, which would be mastering. In this case, again, I'm back to Ozone and my SSL emulation plugin. This is probably a little over maximized right now, but you understand that this is a lot of this. These are finite moves. These are very small moves. You're making tiny adjustments to things like your threshold that are making all the difference in the world, and that's how you dial in a sound. Thanks for sticking around and listening to me babble about beats. I hope you learned something today. There's some related content here. Check that out. Please subscribe to my channel, and as always, like or share this, and comment below because I do read them. Until the next Celldweller production, this is Clayton signing off.